be here for many reasons, and one is of course that Hank was always very important for my own work and understanding. This I think was our very first met. It was in New York at the Varieties of Understanding conference some years ago. Okay, but what I want to talk about today is I think it fits very well with what Hank just presented. I want to suggest an account of degrees of understanding that takes Hank's conception as a starting point. And here I think it can be very brief, so he had a nice summary. I just mentioned a few points. I think at the heart of his account is this understanding between this distinction between understanding a phenomenon and understanding series, where understanding a phenomenon he identifies with having an adequate explanation of the phenomenon and understanding a theory, being able to make use of the theory. And then a crucial thesis of him is that the first requires the second. And I think the justification for that requires at least two assumptions. And one of them is that an explanation that is capable of providing understanding needs to be based on a theory. And the second one is that having an explanation in relevant sense requires being able to make use of the theory in order to construct the explanation, and which often involves the construction then of a model that somehow fits the phenomenon to the explanation. And I think this basic idea is then spelled out in terms of these two criteria. We have already seen them. So the first one, understanding a phenomenon. A phenomenon is understood scientifically if and only if there's an explanation of the phenomenon that is based on an intelligible theory and conforms to the basic epistemic values of empirical adequacy and internal consistency. And note there is an interesting shift, I think, from UP to SUP, because where UP in a way says what it means for an agent to understand something, SUP says what it means for a phenomenon to be understood. So there's kind of a shift from a personal to an impersonal account here. And then there's the criterion of intelligibility, and we have already seen that. The scientific theory is intelligible for scientists if they can recognize qualitatively characteristic consequences of the theory without performing exact calculations. Now, Hank explicitly admits that understanding is a matter of degree, but of course it's not so clear how the theory can accommodate this, because there are no degrees here. But in the same footnote, and that's just in the footnote of the book, he suggests that these differences in degrees of understanding correspond with different degrees of intelligibility. And then he adds that this is a topic for further research. So what I want to suggest is an account of degrees of understanding that is at least partly based on a paper course with Benedict Knussel. And I agree with Hank that intelligibility is one of these, let's call it evaluative dimension of understanding, but there are, my suggestion is there are at least two additional evaluative dimensions. And one is representational accuracy, and the other is representational depth. And I think probably Hank will not really like this suggestion as we had before, but I think in the basic idea behind it seems to me compatible with what he is actually saying, because if you remember the criterion for understanding a phenomenon, basically it says there needs to be an explanation, and the explanation needs to be based on an intelligible theory, and it needs to conform to basic epistemic values. And this leaves room, I think, for the possibility that the degree of understanding does not only depend on the intelligibility of the theory, but also on the content of the explanation. So the idea is then the more accurate the explanation is, and the more detailed the explanation is, the better is the understanding. And that seems to be compatible with your theory, and that's basically what I'm going to suggest. So let me start with intelligibility, and I suggest two modifications of the concept. And the first concerns the object of intelligibility. In Hank theory, what needs to be intelligible is the underlying theory. But I think in the end, the degree of understanding depends on the degree of the explanatory, on the degree of the intelligibility of the explanatory model itself. And intelligibility can mean here, I think, exactly the same thing. So enabling the construction of predictions and explanations. And here are two reasons why I think this might be the right thing. So the first is, there seem to be models that are not really based on theories. And if it's possible to get, and it seems to be possible to get understanding through these kinds of models, at least if we accept, as Hank explicitly does, that how possible explanation might just provide this understanding. So we might get some understanding, and I think explanatory understanding, of the predator-prey relationship in terms of the Lakatos model, for instance, which is not really based on a theory. Or we might get some explanatory understanding of social segregation in terms of Schelling's checkerboard model, which is a very simple agent-based model. And for instance, what we can learn here is that already weak preferences for neighbors of the same group lead to relatively strongly segregated patterns. So if that is right, and if such models provide us at least with some understanding, and the degree of understanding can depend on the degree of the intelligibility of the underlying theory, because there is no such theory. So it seems to depend on the degree of the intelligibility of the model itself. And the second reason is, I think, even if the model is based on a theory, then it doesn't seem to be always the case that the model is equally intelligible than the underlying theory, because models are not only based on theories, they're also based on empirical assumptions, pragmatic considerations of all different kinds. So if you take a climate model, for instance, there you have processes that you cannot model explicitly. Cloud formation is an example, because they occur on scales that are too small in order to be resolved explicitly in the model, or because our understanding is not good enough to model them explicitly, or because modeling them explicitly will be computationally too expensive. And so in these cases, the net effects of these processes are included via parametrizations, and these parametrizations are based on empirical assumptions and not really on theories. If that decreases somehow the intelligibility of the model, then I think it also lowers the understanding of the phenomenon in terms of the model. And if that's the case, then what needs to be intelligible is the model in the end. And I think Hank could accept that, and he sometimes even talks himself about the intelligibility of models, not only of theories. So when he says metrologists are concerned with formulating intelligible methodological theories and models. So this is the first modification. The second concerns the criteria for intelligibility. If you apply Hank's criteria to models and accept that intelligibility comes in degrees, then we get something like this. The intelligibility of a scientific model for a scientist depends on how well the scientist is able to draw quantitative consequences of the model without performing the exact calculations. And I think the idea behind that criteria is somehow to distinguish between scientific theories and oracles. That's clear when he, in this passage, so in contrast to an oracle, a scientific theory should be intelligible. The theory itself should be understood. The opacity of an oracle entails that the way in which its predictions are generated is unclear. The intelligibility of a scientific theory, in contrast, implies that it should be possible to grasp how its predictions are generated. And I fully agree with that, but I think as people have pointed out in connection with simulation models is that the criteria doesn't really make clear that that's actually the case, that the scientist actually is able to explain the behavior of the model. So I suggest to add that as an additional criteria, how well is the scientist able to explain model behavior? How well is she able to explain how the model behavior emerges from the interaction of different model components? Because why doesn't the first one secure this? It's simply because if you can familiarize yourself sufficiently with, let's say, with the black box model, which is kind of an oracle, and that puts you in a position to be able to anticipate qualitatively the outputs without being able to explain model behavior. Okay, and I think that is a kind of a subdimension of understanding, because if you're able to explain the behavior of the model, then you're probably also able, at least to some extent, to explain certain aspects of the behavior of the system, at least if the model is representationally accurate. So that brings me to my next point, representational accuracy, which I mean very roughly simply the degree to which the model, or a bit more precisely the system that the model depicts, is similar to the target in relevant respects, and of course then you can spell that out in very different ways in terms of truth, of morphisms, shared features, exemplification, or whatever, and they want to be neutral with respect to these different types of accounts of scientific explanation. I think if the goal is understanding, and that's all what I need, then the relevant respects of similarity will often be related to causal processes that are potentially relevant for producing the phenomenon. So the idea is simply that if the simulation generates a phenomenon very similar to the one observed in the target, then this seems to show, or at least provides reason to assume that the causal factors that are represented in the model are sufficient for producing the phenomenon. There might be the sufficient ground then to come up with how possible explanations. And if the phenomenon no longer appears in the simulation, if the model is run with the process turned off, then this process doesn't seem to be necessary, at least in the presence of the other factors I modeled in our representation. That might us to so we might then be able to come up with our actual explanation. Now, the representational accuracy of a model is, of course, not directly accessible. You cannot directly compare the behavior of the model with the behavior of the target system. So, representational accuracy needs to be assessed indirectly or justified indirectly by a number of criteria. Maybe here are 4: internal consistency, to what degree is the model internally consistent, if that allows a number of degrees, 4 degrees. Coherence with background knowledge, we can include basic physical theories, but also well-confirmed empirical assumptions. So to what degree is the model as an account of the phenomenon under investigation, coherent with background knowledge and assumptions. Empirical accuracy of model results. How well do model results relevant for the phenomenon under investigation resemble the status of the target system, as depicted in observation data of sufficient quality, and also robustness. So the question how well the model results agree with results of other models or other model versions. Now, if we can use these kind of criteria to assess the representational accuracy of a model, then the question is what are the implications of that for scientific understanding? And Hansby, I think, is very clear, and he made that all very clear in his introduction. According to him, representational accuracy is not a necessary condition for scientific understanding. Remember, in SUP, there is no veridicality condition in SUP. All that is required is there's an explanation that is based on intelligible theory and confirms to epistemic values. And at several places, he explicitly rejects representational accuracy as a necessary condition. So here is one. Whether or not theories or models can be used for understanding phenomena does not depend on whether they are accurate representations of reality underlying the phenomenon. And the arguments he gives for that are basically, or are based typically on examples of highly idealized models, superseded theories, incompatible models, and so on. And I think this argument might not be that straightforward, because it's of course possible that you base an explanation on a highly idealized models, and the explanation is still correct as long as the model allows you to kind of pick out the real difference makers. But I want to accept that and say, okay, representational accuracy is not a necessary condition for understanding. So let's just accept that, at least for the sake of the argument, and therefore, but I have to say, I've also really sympathize with this view. But my point is that even representational accuracy is rejected as a necessary condition for understanding, it might still be the case that it is an evaluative dimension of understanding. And I think that's what we should accept in the end. So even if radically false, highly idealized models and superseded theories can lead to understanding, at least can lead to understanding, then the degree of this understanding, I would suggest, depends on the representational accuracy of the model or the theory. So a bit more precisely, the idea is that the degree of understanding a phenomenon that a model is capable of providing depends on how accurately the model represents the target for an account of the phenomenon. Now, of course, representational accuracy is only one among several criteria for understanding. So increasing representational accuracy of the model does not necessarily improve one's understanding, since it, of course, can decrease the model's intelligibility. And I think that's something that Hank very often stresses, and I think that's completely right. Now, why should we accept it as an evaluative dimension, even if it's not a necessary condition? I think simply because an account that only accepts intelligibility as an evaluative criteria leads to implausible judgments of comparative degrees of understanding. And here's the very simplified example. We had it already before, but it's really very simplified. So suppose that at some point in time, and I think that's now important, the Ptolemaic theory about the motion of the planets was equally intelligible to a Ptolemaic astronomer than Copernicus' theory to a Copernican astronomer. And then I think it seems to me clear that the Copernican astronomer understood the motion of the planets better than her Ptolemaic contemporary. And if that's the case, then the difference in degree of understanding cannot depend on the difference of intelligibility, because the intelligibility is the same, so it needs to depend on the representational accuracy. Now that's very rough and of course needs to be worked out in detail, so I want to jump to another example I'm more familiar with, and this concerns the explanation of 20th century global warming. So suppose we want to explain 20th century global warming by means of a very simple zero-dimensional linear energy balance model, which is based on this one linear differential equation, where you can see the heat capacity, then you have temperature, you have time, and F is a linear combination of the different radiative forcing factors, and lambda is a feedback parameter. Now suppose we take this equation to construct two different models, or two different model versions, and they differ with respect to the factors we include in F. So in the first model, the F includes the natural forcing factors, changes in solar irradiance and aerosols from volcanic activity, and as the anthropogenic forcing factors includes these three greenhouse gases. Now we can use the model to run a hypothesis test for 20th century global warming, and we do that by comparing two simulations. In the one simulation, we include the anthropogenic and the natural forcing factors, and in the other one, we keep the natural force, the anthropogenic forcing factors constant at their pre-industrial averages, and then what we get is something like the results are what we have here in the figure. So the blue one is the simulation with the natural factors, the red one is the simulation with the natural and anthropogenic forcing factors, and you see the natural, the second one, or the red one, fits fairly well with the data which is the black curve. Now suppose we construct a different model with the same natural forcing factors, but as anthropogenic forcing factors we include only CO2. And now we calibrate the model, so we get different values for the heat content and different values for the feedback parameter lambda. And then we can run the same hypothesis test, and we get the results that you see here below, and they're very similar to the one we have in the first case. Of course, because we calibrated the model. Now, the idea is that the first model allows for a better understanding than the second one. And for instance, because it allows us to estimate the ceteris paribus contributions of different forcing factors, for instance, like the contribution of agriculture in terms of methane emissions. How can we explain that? Not in terms of intelligibility, because I think the two models are equally intelligible in that case, because they're based on the same equation. Difference are only parameter values and boundary conditions. And I think if we apply the two criteria, it's fairly clear that in both cases we get the same thing. So a worse model user will be able to anticipate qualitatively characteristic consequences, either by changing the input and observing the outputs, or by studying the equation. And she will also be able to explain the model behavior basically based on the equation. So the intelligibility seems to be more or less the same. The empirical accuracy also more or less the same. There are some differences, but they can be explained away in a way. So that seems also more or less to be equal. So the difference is only the representational accuracy, and that seems to be what explains the difference in degree of understanding. So if that's correct, then representational accuracy is an evaluative dimension of understanding. Okay, let's go very quickly to this third dimension that I suggest, representation depth. Here, I have to confess I'm a bit unsure, but I presented one, and then we see what you think about it. So, the idea here is that that refers to the level of detail and comprehensiveness with which a model describes the processes producing the phenomenon that is to be understood. The idea is, if you have a model that not only describes a phenomenon on a phenomenological level, but also describes the underlying mechanisms that leads to a better understanding, or if you have a model that explicitly resolves processes that are only included via parameterization in another model, then this also provides better understanding. That's in a way the idea behind it. So the claim is that the degree of understanding a phenomenon that a model is capable of providing depends on how deeply the model represents the processes producing the phenomenon. Again, this is only one of many, or at least three evaluative dimensions. So increasing the representational depth of a model does not necessarily improve one's understanding, since again it can of course decrease the model's intelligibility. But the idea is that if all the things are equal, a representationally deeper model allows for a better understanding, since it allows for more mechanistic understanding. I'm not sure whether that's really true, but I want to suggest it and maybe make it a bit more clear by suggesting an example. Maybe that gives an impression what I have in mind and why I think it's not the same thing as representational accuracy. So let's take a state-of-the-art cloud model as a general circulation model or a global circulation model. You can use this kind of model for the same type of hypothesis test as I used before the energy balance model, and you get very similar results. You have them on the right side, below only with the anthropogenic, only with the natural forcing factors, above with the natural and anthropogenic forcing factors, and the picture looks very similar as before. Nonetheless, I would say that the GCM allows a higher degree of understanding. And the idea is that while the energy balance model, the simple energy balance model, the first one, specifies the causal factors and also the relations and relative contributions of them to global warming, the GCM explicitly models many of the underlying climate processes. Now, if that's true, that the first one provides better understanding, then the second one, again, the question is again, how can we explain it? Not in terms of intelligibility, because here it's even worse. The GCM is very likely to be less intelligible than the energy balance model, because it's highly epistemically opaque, as it's often called, because of the very complicated history, because of the complexities of the models and so, and this limits the ability of the model users to explain model behavior. So intelligibility cannot be the difference here. But I would say they are also equally representational accurate for an account of the cause of 20th century global warming, because they include all relevant causal factors and also more or less adequate to represent their relation. So there's no difference concerning representational accuracy. But of course the GCM has a larger degree of representational depth. It represents the phenomenon at lower levels of description. And that is the idea, that is what makes it more fruitful for understanding, or why it provides a better understanding. It allows, for instance, to see how increasing levels of greenhouse gases have changed the temperature at various locations. That's not possible with the energy balance models, because there are no spatial dimensions there. So that is a difference, and it also allows to estimate the contribution of different feedbacks, for instance, the role of water vapor and so on. So if that's true, then representational depth seems to be an evaluative dimension of understanding. So to conclude the idea, let's say the account that results is this one. So the degree to which a model is capable of providing a scientist with understanding of a phenomenon in a target depends on how intelligible the model is for the scientist, how accurately it represents for an account, it represents the target for an account of the phenomenon, and how deeply it represents the processes producing the phenomenon. The first condition concerns the relation between a model and the user, and the second and the third concern the relation between a model and the target system. The threshold for outright attributions of understanding is contextually determined, so it depends on the context how well the model needs to perform with respect to the different dimensions in order to ascribe outright understanding. And of course, determining the degree of understanding is subject to informal evaluations and judgments for reasons familiar from Kuhn's discussion of theory choice, for instance. Conditions involve terms that are open to interpretation, call for further explications. There are no effective procedures for assessing how well the conditions are met. And probably most importantly, it's in general impossible to specify in an exact and context-independent way how to weight the different criteria and which trade-offs between them are admissible. So in context, intelligibility might be more important than representational terms. In other contexts, it might be the other way around. Let me close by two advantages of an account in terms of evaluative dimensions. So I think the shift from necessary condition for outright attributions of understanding to evaluative dimensions and comparative degrees of understanding is a step forward, since judgments of comparative degrees are usually less complex and more reliable than outright judgments. And I think that's generally the case, but it's also the case with respect to understanding. Secondly, taking intelligible and representational qualities, or accuracy and depths, as good-making features of understanding rather than as necessary conditions, I think has the advantage that it accounts for the fact that these dimensions play an important role in description and also the evaluation of understanding, without denying that there might be contexts in which you ascribe understanding, even though some of these conditions are hardly met or maybe not even met at all. Okay, thanks.